Good evening, folks, and welcome back to Wilderness Wargaming once again. With 10th edition approaching very quickly and a big reveal of possibly 10th edition or possibly a new Space Hulk game tomorrow from Games Workshop, I thought I'd talk about 5 rules that I would really like to see changed and simplified or eliminated in 10th edition. One big complaint about 9th edition is that the game is very complicated, and getting rid of some rules that are redundant or overly similar would, in my view, be really pretty great. Now, before we get into this, I'm not going to talk about stratagems, because we all know there's a lot of them. I'm not going to talk about points, cost, or balance. These are just rules that I think are contributing to excessive complexity in the game, and I would like to see them changed or removed. So let's get right into it. Number 5, strategic reserves. Now, some units like Repentia or Space Marine Eradicators are very popular to put into strategic reserves. And right now, under the current rules in Arcs of Omen, aircraft have to go there. And if you're not too familiar, strategic reserves are a way you place units that do not have a native ability to do what's called deep strike, or basically teleport or land on the battlefield at later turns in the game. Under Arcs of Omen, it does not cost command points to do this. You get them for free. The difference is they have different rules than the deep strikers. And the aircraft right now have to do it as mandatory in the Arcs of Omen rules patch. Now, I don't particularly like this because it really could be the same as the deep strike. They could always be said to be teleporting in or otherwise arriving somehow, even if they don't have the native rule. The only thing you really need is for it to cost command points. But by getting rid of strategic reserves and combining it into one rule set, we get one type of rule that players have to remember, and that is not excessively confusing, especially for more casual or newer players. Aircraft, we do know there's some issues with them, but just have them work in reverse. They should cost CP to not start in deep strike. It's not too hard to remember aircraft specifically. And if a unit has a drop pod or a drop pod like ability such as the Eldari Falcon, just allow first round deployment for those. Pretty simple. Number 4, opponent specific rules. So while these guys and these guys really love fighting each other, and these guys here are still pretty mad about Istvan 5 even 10,000 years later, we don't need rules for them to take on those specific opponents. These rules tend to feel like the army has a bonus, but it doesn't actually do anything unless you're fighting that specific opponent. And it adds to excessive stratagems because you often find additional stuff tacked onto this inside the stratagem section. And we can probably just drop them entirely. If that makes an army weaker, it probably needed a buff anyhow. These rules are a source of additional complexity, even if they're not complex themselves. Really, they can be taken out and that can be left in the lore. Number 3, ignoring cover. Now, battlefields are pretty interesting to look at a lot of time, and some of them involve fairly expensive terrain that's taken a lot of effort to create and which looks really cool. And unfortunately, when we ignore it, we not only take away from the value of that terrain that sometimes somebody's put a lot of effort into making, but also it devalues the positioning aspect of the game, which is important, especially for newer players to learn. Armies that have this to excess really become very difficult to play against too, because all you can really do is hide behind terrain. You can't actually use it and make much in the way of decisions. And a lot of times those armies also have units that have extreme armor penetration and other buffs that make this excessively punishing and contribute to a delete key effect on some units. So we probably don't need to replace this with anything special. Just cut the points of the units involved if it's a big nerf to them. Often those units are pretty highly costed to begin with. Now, there are some rules that might need to be rethought, such as the one Black Templar Oath that trades away terrain benefits for invulnerable saves, but that's something we can work out on a case-by-case basis. Number 2, phase damage caps and damage zero effects. So, Satan Shards and Phoenix Lords that I know of, I don't know if there's other units that do this, take only 3 damage per phase, and then it caps out. And I don't think this is too great because it doesn't matter how much shooting is directed at them. It does kind of create the mental image of a torrent of fire coming at them and only a small amount having an effect. But you can also get that effect from a small amount of very effective fire. We also have half damage effects on units such as Morven Val and many other high quality headquarters units. And then units like Dreadnoughts have -1 damage pretty prevalently. Then there's also stratagems and psychic powers and things like that that allow a unit to ignore the first attack in a phase, change its damage to 0, or possibly choose an attack in a phase. This is too many rules to ignore damage, especially when combined with the fact that you also have the random feel no pain rules. So what do we need to do for this? Well, like I said, this is overly complicated. It's very easy to make mistakes when you're already keeping track of so much else in a rules-heavy game, of things like whether or not you used your damage zero this phase or whether it was actually the last phase, and was it 2 wounds or 3 wounds this guy already took, and how many were the last phase. Um, it also has wildly different effects. Some armies are only really active in 1 phase or maybe 2, and that can make it very, very hard to deal with these units, especially if they find a way to recover wounds. We don't really need this. We can replace the change to 0 with a -1 damage static effect, and the no more than 3 per phase with a half damage effect. Now, there are 2 effects that change damage to 1. They change the damage characteristic of the attack to a 1. This is very, very powerful, but it's only found on 2 relics, one that the Sisters have and one that the Black Templars have. And they're not allowed on named characters because they're relics and there's no way to take them. Those can stay. What we don't want to see is this effect to proliferate and become super common. There are some armies that maybe could use one like that, but I would not have it be a common thing at all. Then we can also keep our cancellation effects, effects that, such as, for example, the Night Lords have the clause of the Stygian Count that allow it to ignore damage reduction. Keep these and allow it to ignore the half damage or the change damage to 1 or the -1 damage effect. Do not allow them to do the wound shrugs. Because the wound shrugs can reduce damage all the way to 0 and these ones cannot, they also have a minimum damage 1 on them. And because the rolls are random, it should not ignore them. They should be considered 2 different effects, and feel no pains should always work and should never be ignored. That keeps 2 distinct effects that are easy to tell apart and makes it less complicated overall. The last one that we have, and some people are not going to like this, but I'm going to say it now, ignore Invulnerables. This needs to go. Some units that are notorious for having delete key weapons have this on them. This is not good. These weapons already have extreme high armor penetration and are almost always buffed to a point where they're hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, and rerolling 1s on 1 or both of those. Or getting automatic 6s on them. This is not good. This is very difficult to deal with, and yes, I realize that in tournament plays there are ways to deal with this, but these have a very bad effects on casual gaming, and in the case of the Votan Land Fortress there, it has had a distorting effect on the entire army, where in my opinion at least, this one gun has caused the entire army to become overcosted because it is just so effective. It's also found on rather more innocuous units, such as Ephrael Stern, but you know what? It's going to have to go for her too. What we can do is use inflict mortals on successful wound mechanics instead. And the reason for that is that mortals already bypass invulnerable saves. The reason that this mechanic is so unnecessary and so distorting is that a mechanic to do that already existed. There was no need to slap it on top of extreme high damage guns, especially one that also got 3 mortal wounds on top of that, or one that spills damage as if they were mortal wounds. There's also psychic effects that do that, and the same thing applies to them. We want to probably change the psychic powers to allow it to bestow the ability to inflict mortal wounds on a 6 to wound on a unit the same way. This will eliminate this ability and give us just one way that we ignore invulnerables, and that will be to inflict mortals. There's no reason to have redundant rules that do the same thing and then tend to get slapped on weapons that have very distorting effects on the game. Well, what do you think about this? I'd be interested to know what rules you'd like to see changed, reduced, eliminated, combined, or maybe even added in 10th edition. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, comment, and click the notifications bell for more great content from Wilderness Wargaming, and we hope to see you back here again very soon.